Hello, everybody, and welcome to Theology and Peace's quarterly speaker series for May. We have today a wonderful guest, the Reverend Dr. Julia Robinson Moore from the Department of Religious Studies at the University of North Carolina, Charlotte, who will be speaking about her groundbreaking work on the intersection of Rene Girard and issues of race relations in the American context. Since Dr. Moore will also be one of our plenaries at our Theology and Peace annual conference next month, before introducing our talk today, first let me say something about that event and her workshop there. Theology and Peace invites you to join us at our annual conference on June 10th through 13th in Des Plaines, Illinois, which is a suburb of Chicago, at the campus of Casa Escalia Retreat House. The theme is teaching and tools. And we have several excellent speakers who will focus on both theological reflection and on practical strategies on the ground for doing peacemaking and healing work in today's context. We hope you will join us and sign up. Early bird registration runs until May 15th, and there's more information on the Theology and Peace website and Facebook page. In addition to today's speaker, we will welcome Father James Allison, a well-known Catholic Girardian theologian, for a keynote address, as well as having a plenary by pastor and recent internet star, Adam Erickson, of the Clackamas United Church of Christ in Milwaukee, Oregon, for a practical tutorial in the use of social media as an outreach and peace-building strategy. The Reverend Ellen Corchella, a former federal prosecutor and member of Theology and Peace, will also be sharing a workshop on her use of mimetic theory in her current hospital chaplaincy work. In her plenary workshop at the conference in June, Professor Moore will also be focusing on the pragmatic aspects of applying mimetic theory in the real world. She will be describing and answering questions about her innovative community and pastoral work called the Equity in Memory and Memorial, a peace-building initiative that works toward creating equity in repatriating enslaved burial grounds in the city of Charlotte, North Carolina, and beyond. The Equity in Memory and Memorial Project, also known as E2M, came out of Dr. Moore's second book project that examines the complexities of Black and white race relations through the context of the Presbyterian Church in the city of Charlotte. An ordained Presbyterian minister within the Presbytery of Charlotte, which is the Presbyterian Church USA, she found a way to directly connect her academic research with the Presbyterian communities she served. Through this intensive interracial healing project, she and her husband, the Reverend Ricky D. Moore, strive to bring connection and conciliation to both Black and white church communities historically divided by the legacies of slavery, and to preserve sacred burial spaces. This project uses a multi-pronged approach to recovering the legacy of Black enslaved burial grounds, which involves archaeology and historical records, storytelling, mourning, contemplative prayer, and the insights of mimetic theory, especially the concept of loving mimesis, along with brain science. Descendants of both those who were enslaved and those who were enslavers come together in a trauma-sensitive process which is committed to respecting and affirming everyone's common humanity. This work is already serving as a model for other similar projects. Very innovative and interdisciplinary. Today, as a way to get to know her and her work, the Reverend Dr. Moore will share with us a different facet of her research on Girard and race relations in the American context. This talk and the larger academic project it represents grew out of a conversation Professor Moore had with Rene Girard in 2008 about applying his concepts to the systematic study of racial issues. Girard makes only the occasional scattered remark about race or slavery in relation to scapegoating, but he frequently uses the imagery of lynching. Moore decided to look at the practices and rhetoric of real lynchings in American history, primarily of Black men, through the lens of Girard's concepts of rivalry and scapegoating. She recalls in her 2021 Contagion article entitled "The Frontiers of Race and Mimetic Theory, American Lynchings and Racial Violence," upon which this talk today is based, how excited Girard was when she told him that she was going to take up and develop this project. He said he had always wanted to see this done, even if he himself had not done it at any length. In her article, she calls for this type of theoretical analysis to be incorporated and brought fully to fruition within the world of Girardian scholarship and practice. Her work is adding a much needed dimension to mimetic theory and starting new conversations. Julia Robinson Moore, who earned her PhD from Michigan State University, joined the Department of Religious Studies at UNC Charlotte in 2005. She teaches courses in African American religion, religions of the African diaspora, and racial violence in America. Her first book, called Race, Religion, and the Pulpit, Reverend Robert L. Bradby and the Making of Urban Detroit, which was published in 2015, explores how Second Baptist Church of Detroit's 19th minister became the catalyst for economic empowerment, community building, and the formation of an urban African American working class in Detroit. Her current research project, as we've seen, is called Remembered: Enslaved Burial Grounds and the Making of the City of Charlotte, and speaks to the present-day realities of enslaved cemeteries around the city of Charlotte and their connection to American Presbyterianism. The University of North Carolina at Charlotte supports the Equity in Memory and Memorial Project as part of its strategic mission to serve as an urban research center that benefits the city of Charlotte, a community-engaged component of her Remembered project. Dr. Moore also has a third book and research project in the works entitled Modern Lynchings: Mimetic Theory, Christianity, and Racial Violence in the New South, which seeks to situate race as a category of analysis within mimetic theory through the study of anti-Black violence and terrorism in the New South. This talk today and the 2021 article in the journal Contagion that I mentioned before come out of this forthcoming book. She will be speaking today on The Double Bind of Racism: The History of Race, Religion, and American Lynchings through the lens of Rene Girard. So just some housekeeping details. Please feel free to put both your questions and comments at any time in the chat below, and we will have time after the presentation for some Q&A. Theology and Peace member Susan Wright will be moderating the Q&A via the chat function and posing your questions to Dr. Moore. We should have about half an hour for questions, so don't be shy on this important and timely topic. You can post multiple questions if you want. With that, I'm delighted today to introduce to you my friend, the Reverend Dr. Julia Robinson Moore. Julia, it's so good to have you with us. We know each other quite well already. I'm privileged, along with Julia, to be part of an ongoing monthly online Zoom research and mutual support group called the Loving Mimesis Generative Dialogue Group, where we explore, develop, and apply the constructive concept of loving mimesis that I've developed and which Julia incorporates in her work. Her insights are always so profoundly timely, and I've gained so much from knowing her. Welcome, Julia.
Thank you. Thank you, Rebecca Adams. It's a privilege to have you as a friend, and just delighted to be here in the Theology and Peace community. Thank you for this very honorable invitation. I'm going to jump right in to this, and I thought what I would do is give you a little background on my journey and how I got to this moment of using and thinking with mimetic theory. And so I wanted to situate myself positionally before I jump into my analysis. What you will be hearing is another chapter in the book that I am hoping to finish before 2026 on mimetic theory and race. So growing up between the Baptist and Presbyterian faith within Protestantism, I learned from an early age that democracy went hand in hand with the doctrines of Christianity. As a child, a good Christian, attempting to be as a child, I understood Christianity to be synonymous with a good citizen and a person that loved their neighbors. So I grew up for a while thinking that these connections were mutually inclusive of one another. It was only as I reached adulthood that the truths of Christianity began to bump up against my experience as an African American and as a Black female in a racialized society. Raised primarily in a predominantly Black Presbyterian church, I was shocked to find that when I gathered with fellow Christians in the larger predominantly white culture of the Presbyterian Church USA, a few of my fellow brothers and sisters in Christ did not recognize the fullness of my humanity. Over time, various racist incidents in my interaction with the Presbyterian Church and their larger white Christian communities put me in a theological quandary. I cannot reconcile fellow believers in Christ who rejected me, a Christian in the same denomination, simply because my skin had more melanin or less than theirs. I had to come to grips with the paradoxes of Christian practice when racialized ideologies frame the message of salvation. These paradoxes were further enhanced when one day on a camping trip in Michigan, my mother drove me toward the entrance of a KOA campground in the evening, only to find a local gathering of the Ku Klux Klan in a circle in formation with torches lit high. What was to be our first night of a fun camping trip turned out to be a frightening introduction to more vocal forms of white supremacy and the image of a burning cross. That image of the cross, which my community of faith was so tied to, now stood etched in my memory as a sign of fear, terrorism, and as I learned later, Black hatred. The cross of Christ became an enigma on some level within my psyche. Even as I entered full-time ministry as an ordained minister in the Presbyterian faith, Christianity with its messages of forgiveness and love for me was thrown up against sentiments of white hatred, anti-Black terrorism, and something that I would later learn would be white supremacy. And these were all contextualized by Christianity. My quest to make sense of what scholar Orlando Patterson argues as the two religions lurking in the bosom of the Christian church became my exploration into the connections between race, religion, and violence. As a new professor at UNC Charlotte back in 2005, almost 20 years ago, this journey began in earnest when I was asked to present a public lecture on the history of lynching in America. The task proved to be the genesis of a long research path into the history of America's racial violence, and one that would be nurtured by a conversation that Rebecca Adams has already talked to you about, my encounter with Girard. Let me give you a little background on that encounter with him. So it was 2008. It's my first time ever at the Colloquium of Religion and Violence and Religion. And I'm in the beautiful setting of Riverside. We're in a lovely hotel, and it's one of the plenary talks. And I think the guest speaker is actually a former colleague of mine who was supposed to talk on Levi-Strauss. It turned out to be a very contentious talk, but aside from that, I got an opportunity to sit at Girard's table and meet him and his wife and have this very fascinating and awe-inspiring conversation with him. And from that conversation began an invitation to come back to California, to Riverside, to present some of my initial findings and to work with William Johnson, who's the editor at Michigan State University. And so that's how I got really motivated to really dig deep into that. I never thought my first day at a conference that I would meet Rene Girard himself. And so it was a very powerful meeting. So let me now turn to building on what my 2021 article presented here. It says, I want to start with the understanding that while Girard did not fully explore the intersections of his thinking with the Black experience of racial and social economic violence, his references to the lynching of Black males, especially one Black male in his book, The Scapegoat, are telling. These short references, though unfinished, reveal the pathways of Girard's thinking about race and racial violence. Again, my article from 2021 explores the threads of Girard's thinking and offers examples of how mimetic theory can expose the mechanism of racial violence when performed through lynching. Expanding my arguments from that article, I reflect on how Girard, back in 2008 at Riverside, noted that the horns of the sacrificial animal are prominently displayed in the homes of the persecutors and operated as sacred objects. His arguments brought to mind W.E.B. Du Bois's account of the lynching of Sam Holmes in 1899. Sam Holmes' lynching was noted not just as a mythic representation, but a horribly lived reality that was contagiously imitated in nuanced ways throughout the small town of Newman, Georgia. Du Bois was shocked to walk past the local butcher shop of the town to see the open displayed knuckles of Holmes' dismembered body in his hand, especially. The butcher, like many white citizens of the town, had taken parts of Holmes' body as relics to be proudly displayed. The spectacle of Sam Holmes' knuckles, placed in a central location within this southern town, functioned where meat and other products were brought for public consumption, a cultural practice that was indicative of the normacy of such displays in white supremacist towns like Newman, Georgia. Such racial trophies were not only condoned by the larger society, but were set up as spectacles that reinforced the rituals of racial violence that stabilized the harmony of the social order. In chapter 4 of Things Hidden Since the Foundation of the World, Rene Girard argues that when a violent destructuring occurs within a society's understanding of its origin, its identity, and well-being, a mimetic crisis develops, which releases the victimage mechanism, or what this paper will refer to as the surrogate mechanism, a process where the community in crisis feels its identity and safety threatened. This crisis can occur externally from outside forces or internally within the community. Once this happens, the community in crisis seeks ways to vent its angst, its fear, and bring back a sense of safety. Realizing this need consciously or unconsciously, the community begins to identify members within their own group to scapegoat based on perceived weaknesses, which eventually lead to the scapegoat's murder or isolation, carried out by all the members of the community. The collective murder or isolation of the scapegoat for a time restores communal identity, safety, and harmony, and the social order. However, this is short-lived. For Girard, the collective murder of the scapegoat in reality is a representation of collective violence, which for him is a description of lynching. Studying the myths of Euripides and tangling a bit with the assertions of Levi-Strauss, Girard considered, quote, why myths so frequently represented collective violence in order to express something that has no relation to it, end of quote. In this respect, Girard refers to the surrogate mechanism, collective violence, as a lynching, or what he termed a camouflaged lynching, end of quote. Even as he studied the myths of the Ojibwe and other indigenous groups who had themselves been scapegoated and brutally murdered by white colonial settlers who were following the dictates of Christian ideas, Girard framed the contagious nature of collective violence as the lynching of the victim. His insights into the all against the one collective of violence was captured in the word lynching, a term filled with racialized connotations that directly connected to the brutalization and murder of many, many Black and brown human beings on trees, telephone poles, and bridges. Girard further asked the question, quote, whether we should see in the innumerable lynchings in mythology the dramatic representation of pure discrimination, end of quote. Something that he felt had the possibility of always resulting in collective murder. Girard even went a step further and asked, quote, if all discrimination resulted in collective murder, end of quote. He posed this question because he saw the propensity in collective violence to radically eliminate those deemed as threats. For Girard, the society that engaged in collective violence justified its actions based on, quote, some misdeed or flaw attributed to the victimized, end of quote. Again, the term and connotations of lynching capture for Girard the radical elimination of the victim by a society in crisis. He writes, quote, there is one and only perspective capable of making lynching a positive action, since it sees the victim as a real threat that must be dealt with by any means available. And this is the perspective of the lynchers themselves, the perspective of the lynchers on their own lynching, end of quote. Black people at the turn of the 20th century were indeed paradoxical obstacles to white hegemonic agendas and seen as real threats in Girardian sense. Freed from the bonds of slavery and recognized as citizens under the Constitution after the Civil War, Black people stood as equal competitors for land, money, and power in the new America. To Southerners, free Black people constituted an incredible frontal assault to the Southern way of life and America's so Southern identity. No longer able to objectify Black and brown peoples as property, nor control their bodies, especially Black males, many Southerners looked at this moment as a threat. Black people and brown people were considered living symbols of chaos and disorder to a segregationist culture built on maintaining the purity of the white race. If white supremacy in America was built and rooted in the idea of the inherent inferiority of Black and brown people, as well as white surveillance and control over those people, then the greatest challenge to such hegemony were free Black and brown people with constitutional rights to assert an equality equal to their white counterparts. Such actions shook the very foundation of white supremacy that was historically anchored in external mythical perceptions of degraded Black and brown others. Girard's work, I argue, enables us to shine a microscope on the imitative and contagious nature of white supremacy in America. It helps us understand white supremacists' desire for control and subjugation of Black and brown human beings for economic and social political power. His explication of the surrogate mechanism, when contextualized by America's racial climate, reveals the ultimate scandalon. Remember, a scandalon is a paradoxical obstacle that is almost impossible to avoid, according to Girard, and that the more this obstacle or scandal repels us, the more it attracts us. And so this scandalon is actually, for me, taking place not in a vacuum, but in a religious context that is filled with Christian metaphors, allegory, and biblical imperatives. And it is also layered over with aspects of democracy and the ideas of human rights. These are all complicated by issues of race and racialization. Turning to James Cone, he helps me think a little bit more with Girard's application and the ways in which I'm seeing race move through America, especially in the South at the turn of the 20th century. James Cone recognized the kind of duplicity in America's cultural claims and morality when he studied lynching. His work, The Cross and the Lynching Tree, challenges fellow theologians across the academy who have left the lynching tree conspicuously absent from their theological discourses. For Cone, the crucifixion was clearly a first-century lynching, according to his words. And the portrayal of Jesus that he sees as he applies this to lynching it for him becomes a collective murder on a tree. For Cone, such assertions draw a reciprocal connection between Christ's crucifixion on the cross and that of the victim of lynching trees in America's history. Cone's curiosity about why Christian ministers have, quote, failed to connect the cross to lynching trees is telling. Though we may disagree about the theological implications of Christ's crucifixion, it is important to note how Christianity has shadowed and even contextualized white supremacy and anti-Black violence in the South. For Cone, Rayford Logan's Black Nadir, his book was published in 1954, produces the most violent and dangerous period, or not produces, but explores the most violent and dangerous period for Black Americans. He writes, quote, in the lynching era, between 1880 to 1940, white Christians lynched nearly 5,000 Black men and women in a manner with obvious echoes of the Roman crucifixion of Jesus. As Jesus was an innocent victim of mob hysteria and Roman imperial violence, many African Americans were innocent victims of white mobs, thirsting for blood in the name of God and in defense of segregation, white supremacy, and the purity of the Anglo-Saxon race, end of quote. For Cone, both the cross and the lynching tree were symbols of terror, instruments of torture, and execution reserved primarily for slaves, criminals, and insurrectionists, that both Jesus and Blacks were publicly humiliated and subject to the utmost indignity and cruelty. Cone's words capture the long history of anti-Black terrorism and violence in America, as well as its most virulent and violent forms of extralegal justice, lynching. We certainly see this in the lynching of Sam Holds, sparked by white Southern communities who are committed to Christianity. And yet the why and how of Christianity and its culturally driven connections to the practice of lynching remains veiled in Cone's analysis. I believe Girard's work offers answers and fills in blanks that Cone doesn't quite flesh out. It's important to note that James Cone himself saw a link between Girard and his work, and this link is revealed only in one small footnote that you have to dig for it, but it's in the cross and the lynching tree, one small footnote referencing Girard's work in relationship to Black suffering. Picking up where Cone's analysis drops off with Girard, I argue that mimetic theory explains the why and the how of racism and its reification. Girard's work also lays the foundation for building the process that disrupts negative accusative mimesis. Applying his insights to America's cultural and evangelical context, I argue that when racism is enacted within the context of white Christian supremacy, a surrogate mechanism is at work that predisposes adherents to violent enactments of sacrificial death that reflects a corruption of the lived practice of Christianity. If Cone argues lynchings are an enactment of a crucified Christ by white lynchers, then white lynchers are corrupting the sacrificial messages of the gospel of Jesus Christ. They are enacting a misreading of the crucifixion, a perspective that fails to see the innocence of Jesus, thereby positioning the lynchers as the mob. This kind of Christianity facilitates the surrogate mechanism and allows lynchers to construct a Christian identity that maintains white supremacist sentiments. Thus, in America, there has historically been two Christianities at play, one derived from the heinous tenets of white supremacy and the other from the orthodox meaning of the love of God in Jesus Christ. And like Cone, I see a direct connection between distorted or corrupt forms of Christianity and the practice of lynching in America. Mimetic theory helps me see these distinctions and identify the corruptions. There is also the ways in which mimetic theory helps me fine-tune the depths of white supremacy that Girard refers to as appropriative mimicry. The compulsive tendency of mankind to imitate others' desires so that what is really desired and sought out is whatever is desired and sought by others. as a Christianity is founded in, as the traditional forms of Christianity are founded in non-accusative imitation of Christ, demonstrated in his person, his teaching, his death on the cross, his resurrection, his oneness and authority with God, and his love for God and others, we also see a different kind of Christianity created. I'm going to move and transition to another part of this as I was building this. When I began to look for Girard's understanding and how he understands the role of Christ and the revelation of Christ, meaning that here's this one story that reveals the innocence of Christ. I began to contextualize this in light of the mimetic rivalries that I see within Christianity, specifically a Christianity that's been infused with white supremacist ideology. And I'm going to turn to one of his quotes. So in Things Hidden from the Foundation of the World, Girard picks up some of these themes, and as he moves through it, we start seeing other parts of these themes in battling to the end. And so one of the scriptures that Girard really centers on is, he quotes, paraphrases rather, Colossians chapter 2, verses 15 through 22. And he talks about the power of Christ. He talks about how Christ was able to rule over principalities and rulers. And in moving and looking at the ways in which he is looking at this scripture, and specifically, I went back and I decided, I said, well, let me look at this scripture. Let me look at Colossians chapter 2 in other formats. So I want to read to you one of these founding scriptures. I think it's a founding scripture for Rene Girard as he builds off of it. And then I'll move to his book, Battling to the End. So this particular translation of Colossians chapter 2 is going to be from the Passion Translation. And the Passion Translation says that Jesus erased all our sins, our stained soul, as well as made a public spectacle of all the powers and principalities of darkness, stripping away from them every weapon, all their spiritual authority and power to accuse us. And by the power of the cross, we see how Jesus led them around as prisoners in a procession of triumph. He was not their prisoner, they were his. This is end of quote. As Girard states in Battling to the End, Christ exasperated mimetic rivalries. He agreed to be their victim to reveal mimetic rivalries to the eyes of all. He caused them to appear everywhere in the society, in families. There is no totality that does not run the risk of being affected by the doubling that used to be contained by sacrifice. End of quote. This doubling in mimetic theory for Girard was rooted in his analysis of Gregory Bateson's arguments on what he terms the double bind. Framing his arguments on Bateson's assertions within information theory, a section called the mimesis of apprenticeship and mimesis of rivalry, and this is in his book, Things Hidden, Girard noted that the disciple, the subject, admires and respects the model so much that he does not recognize the signs of rivalry and the behavior of the model, end of quote. I argue that in white Christian supremacy, that imitative actions and imitation is supposed to be non-acquisitive. It's supposed to follow the golden rule of selfless love. But what I see actually happening, especially as I look at Girard's definition of double bind based on Gregory Bateson's argument, and look at the framing of both of these arguments from Girard's understanding of Colossians chapter 2, I argue that white supremacist Christianity sought to imitate a non-accusative model of Christianity and yet still maintain accusative actions, still maintain desires that were mediated for them by settler colonialist regimes, which masked their oppression of indigenous peoples through surface appropriations of Christianity that limited the golden rule, for example, towards those who had land, wealth, and elite class power. This double bind of imitation, according to Girard, turns back against the imitator, even though the model and the whole culture, which in this case would be Southern Christian culture, specifically encourages him to imitate. Building on Girard and Babson's work, I further argue that when we apply the lens of mimetic theory to white supremacy in the American South, specifically looking at its theological forms, we see this double bind within two forms of Christianity that are at play. These two forms of Christianity are actually locked in a double bind, and they actually contextualize the history of anti-Black violence and lynching. The first form of Christianity is based on the teachings of Christ, and the second one is crafted by white supremacist Christians who sought to sacralize the institution of slavery and sanctify derogatory imaginaries of ethnic others based on arbitrary notions of race and caste differences. These kinds of double binds created an internal mediation that played out in dualistic ways within Christianity. This reality in Girardian terms, this sort of double bind of white supremacy was really a reactionary against guilty consciousness of not following Orthodox Christianity or traditional forms of Christianity. And I'm going to conclude my chapter by letting you in finally to where I see some of this double bind happening, where I see the roots of it. So it's not like white supremacists just came up and said, oh, I'm going to be a Christian and I'm going to create these other forms of Christianity to justify it. I really thought about this, and I wanted to look at where is the root of these internal rivalries that create the product by which I am understanding as white supremacist Christianity. And so I begin to look at the rivalries, and so this is where I'm going to kind of end my presentation. If we understand Girard's appropriation of the arguments and building on the arguments of Gregory Batson, we really see that these internal rivalries excuse me, these internal rivalries come out of internal class differences among de-ethnicized Euro-American communities. I'll say that again. Where am I seeing the rise of white Christian supremacist ideas and culture? They arrive from internal rivalries between whites, or what I call de-ethnicized Euro-American communities. And what I mean by de-ethnicized is like you have people who come to America, they're from Ireland and England and France and Germany. But over time, by the time you get to the turn of the 20th century, those ethnic markers are erased, and those groups are actually put in a socially constructed box of whiteness. And I'm saying that internal rivalries are happening between de-ethnicized groups of European communities. They're caught in a mimetic triangle of desire in order to obtain religious and political hegemonic power through its civic and ecclesiastical institutions. I see these rivalries among a number of classes and different religious groups. And where do I really see this start to take place? It really starts happening as early as the colonial period. I'm arguing that before and after the American Revolution, desires are mediated and often lead to sacrificial violence. We see this between Whigs and Tories, between white landowning elites and poor landless whites. We also see this between white Catholics and Protestants, and the list can go on and on. As each of these groups vied for positions of power, consumed by the mediated desires of one another, Africans and indigenous populations became objects of possessions and vehicles for distinctions of wealth, thereby becoming eventually scapegoats. By the turn of the 19th century, white supremacy was spread among a strata of white ethnic groups from Europe who were seeking to imitate the wealth and power of imperialist regimes. These imitations flooded the pews and pulpits of both Catholic and Protestant denominations in America. The result was the emergence of an accusative desire which invaded and corrupted the teachings of Christ and his call for loving one's neighbor. The result of this dehumanized white Christian identity, the result of this de-emphasized white Christian identity was caught in a feedback loop between the nonviolent gospel claims and model of Jesus Christ and the mutated theology of white supremacy that sought to bend the teachings of Christ to justify their violent oppression of indigenous and African peoples and even valorize racial whiteness. This double bind of white supremacist Christianity created an imagination and a depiction of God that was vengeful, violent, and justified victimage through biblical models of punishment. And I will end with one example. As I was doing this, I kept seeing in lynching acts that lynching victims were often whipped before they were lynched. And lynching could be burning, maiming, hanging from a tree, hanging from light posts. So I began to see the whippings were always around 39 times. So I began to look up what is this 39 times? And I found evidence as early as the 1700s. So one example I found was from 1792, and it's connected to the emergence of lynch law. And it prescribed 39 lashes inflicted without trial or law based on mere suspicion of guilt. And most of the times these suspicions were not proven. Historians that tend to study lynch law look at the most noted person who enacted these laws. He was called a regulator. His name is Charles Lynch. And he's seen really around the time of the American Revolution, but he comes into quite a bit of prominence after the American Revolution. He's first known to do whippings against Tories, other white Europeans. And then Charles Lynch would whip them 39 times and then hang them until they were dead from a tree. Now, when I studied Charles Lynch, Lynch is taking his example from, according to him, the example of Moses from the Bible. I don't know how he makes that leap, but this is what he says. He also takes the number of whippings that he metes out to various Tories who he thinks are a threat from two scriptures. The first scripture is from Deuteronomy chapter 25, verse 3, and 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 24. In either case, these scriptures sort of framed Charles Lynch's actions in terms of extra-legal justice. And he really framed his actions as an extension of his Christian identity. And while Tories and other European Americans were alleged as criminals and made to suffer, after the American Revolution, we find that African slaves became the most prominent victims to what we call now, or what historians are calling lynch law. In 1705, for example, the province of Pennsylvania enacted a law against Negroes, this is the quote, alleged to have committed murder, burglary, and rape. This law said that they were to endure 39 lashes and be branded on the forehead with the letter R or T and exported out of the province or either face death. By 1797, the state of Delaware had a similar law where 39 lashes were supposed to be laid on anyone who was being punished for the rape of a white woman. Black women who were raped, indigenous women who were raped, there was no such law for that. So in conclusion, this, I'm a minister, right? So I have like 3 conclusions, but anyway, let me finish. In conclusion, I think that Girard's work offers some serious insights into understanding the nature of the social construction of whiteness and the ways in which race was really made concretized in the colonial and antebellum era. I also think his work helps us understand a kind of reciprocity that is happening between the internal and external mediated rivalries between groups of Euro-Americans that are in America trying to just make a living, and sometimes on the backs of Indigenous and Black people. It is this kind of mimetic crisis, though, where you have these internal rivalries that I see occurring, especially among white Protestant Christians. And it is this kind of rivalry that sets the stage for how we are to really understand what's happening today in America when we see the legacies of racism and mass incarceration and in redlining, and certainly in the seasons before 2020, but certainly after the death of George Floyd. We cannot make those events distinguishable from what's happening early on in the social construction of whiteness. And mimetic theory really helps tease these out. And we cannot ignore the rivalries and accusative nemesis present in historical claims of Christianity. So that's my other last point, is that many people talk about Christianity. We know Jamar Tisby talks about the compromise of churches in his book, The Color of Compromise. And I think we really need to go back, build on works like Tisby, and really look at things through mimetic theory in order to understand the nature of Christianity's corruption by white supremacist imaginaries, and deal with the question of how Christians who claim to love God and love their neighbor and yet still enslave human beings made in the image of God as chattel. So those are things that I am thinking of. You've got a rough draft of one of my chapters. Thank you for your time. I'll open it up for questions.
Julia, thank you so much. That was such an in-depth reading of the relationship of racism, the history of racism, Christianity, and mimetic theory. I learned so much just in this last 45 minutes. So thank you, and I'm sure that others have too. So what I'm going to do is read to you the questions in the chat, and then you can answer. So please, everyone, place your questions in the chat, and I'll just start to read them in the order that they appear, okay? So beginning with Karen. Something I learned a while ago, I could be mistaken, but 40 lashes was thought to be fatal. So 39 lashes will extend the punishment, allowing something else more brutal after. Jesus received 39 lashes before his crucifixion. So another way to justify 39 lashes.
Yeah. So thank you for that, Karen. I really appreciate that. So Deuteronomy chapter 25 actually says 40 lashes. And so what I found is accounts where I'll use North Carolina. North Carolina regulators are looking at Deuteronomy chapter 25, like regulators in Virginia, and they say, well, to make sure we stay fully within the Christian paradigm, let's stick with the 39 lashes that Jesus is. So there's an interplay back with the Judeo-Christian connections around punishment and violence. So yeah, thank you for that.
This question or comment is from George. Thank you for your wonderful, illuminating talk. I was especially pleased to hear about how Girard supported and encouraged your work, since it contradicts an ugly allegation that was made against him by someone in the Girardian community a couple years ago. This person accused Girard of being a racist, offering as evidence the fact that he had little to say about the lynching of African Americans. As someone who spoke with Girard on this very topic, can you rebut this allegation? Was there anything about Girard that suggested to you that he was in any way racist?
Not at all, not at all. To give you a little background on my luncheon conversation in 2008, make a long story short, I was trying to get away from an unruly colleague, and I looked for the nearest table to sit at, and I didn't notice the reserve sign on Girard's table, and so I'm sitting there just trying to compose myself, and Girard comes and sits next to me, and I am aghast, and I apologize to him and say, "Oh, I'm so sorry." And he says, "No, please, please stay." So he's very gracious and open to me. And I have to say, at Riverside, I think I was one of 3 persons of color, and I was the only African American woman in a pretty large conference. It must have been like 300 people there, I think. And I immediately jumped into, hey, I actually had my Girard reader, and I pulled it out, and I said, hey, I want to talk about your work in light of the experiences of African Americans. And I asked him pointedly, I said, you in Scapegoat, you only mention African American one time, and then there's another place. And he said, and that's when he said, I've always wanted my work to speak to that. That was a way or a strand of thinking that I didn't really fully follow. And so it never has entered my mind that Girard was racist or antagonistic against Black people. As I began to look at his early life in North Carolina, especially during the Jim Crow era and the height of the Civil Rights Movement, I can understand why he would shy away from being more vocal and direct with some of his applications or extending application. So yeah, that's my take. And then I got invited back into so many community gatherings with Girard before his health fully gave out. There's no way I thought I was discriminated against by him. So
That's wonderful. So that was so fortuitous, wasn't it?
it was. I need to thank my unruly colleague.
Yeah. This is from Andrew, who says St. Paul said he received the 40 lashes minus 1.
That's right. That's right. That's from that Corinthians verse.
And this is from another Andrew. Does Jesus in gospel accounts ever fall into rivalry with another, or does he always manage to transcend rivalry? I ask because I wonder if there is corollary to contemporary Christian practice. If a nonviolent current of Christian practice falls into rivalry with the white supremacist current, does the nonviolent current does that mean it's still a distortion in some way of true Christian teaching? Is that what you meant, Andrew? Yes.
Okay. I have one example. And so my talk is going to build on the wonderful assertions and applications of Rebecca Adams, who's here. I think that when people operate in nonviolent imitation, it is a kind of mimetism, but it's a positive, generative mimetism that, as Adams would say, values the other for the sake of the other. There's no competition, but there's this desiring for the well-being and value of the other. And then let me turn to a couple examples from the civil rights. So in the civil rights era, you had white male ministers who walked in solidarity in different marches in Selma and Alabama. And they were acting in a nonviolent way. They were modeling a non-accusative kind of model. And they themselves suffered incredible violence, along with many African Americans there are some accounts that say that white ministers, one actually lost their life, a couple of them lost their lives, where they were such an affront to the violent imitation that was going on and the violent models of white supremacy that they lost their lives. And so there's a way that positive mimesis can disrupt and also confront, but also be incredibly threatening to I'll say is traditional forms of imitative violence. So thank you. That's a great question. I hope I answered it.
Yes, Sandra? That gave me the shivers when you said that positive loving mimesis could be an affront and elicit violence. And that is definitely an example, I would agree. So I'll ask a question. I noticed that you said that the Black slaves became objects of desire for the New American Society. I take it after the revolution. Do you want to say more about that? And then what, and maybe this is already obvious, but describe the shift that happened when slavery was taken away, and then when they're no longer slaves, how does the sense their position as object of desire change?
Okay, thank you for that. It's a great question. Yeah, I would say that so let me just go back. I'm here in North Carolina. So North Carolina has a law, and in the early 1700s, even before where I live, Mecklenburg County is actually a county, and you had lord proprietors that would say that if you are a English person or German and you come here, you will be given more land by the amount of by the numbers of people in your family and the amount of slaves that you own. In fact, if you own one slave, you'll get 50 acres. If you own two slaves, you'll get 100 acres. And so if you have poor whites who are trying to come to America to make a living and to have all of the objects that wealthy, rich white people have from England, you try to acquire land. Well, part of your acquirement for land is to have Africans or indigenous people as slaves. And so slaves become a status marker. It becomes a way of social and economic mobility. You not only have their labor for free, but you also are granted a kind of social capital if you own slaves. And that social capital is translated to the acquisition of land. And so there's lots of people who are trying to buy slaves in order to get more acreage, in order to build their crops and plants. After the Civil War, when African Americans are given the same kinds of constitutional status, at least for a little bit, for a little while, as their white counterparts, you have that internal mediation and desire and rivalry between poor whites and wealthy whites. Well, after the Civil War, poor whites don't quite know where they are. And now Black people, indigenous people are vying for the same social economic objects that poor whites are. And so there are these moments where the rivalry between wealthy whites and poor whites is put under the table in order to squash the indigenous people and Black people acquiring the same kind of social capital that they have. It's almost as if the social order is controlled before the Civil War, and then after the Civil War, it's in disorder, and so they unite and disunite in really weird ways in order to maintain white hegemony in particular ways. So,
is this a Pilate and Herod?
yeah, it's a Pilate in here. Yeah. Or as my students say, they're frenemies for a second.
Right.
Go back. Yeah.
How much longer do we have?
we have another 30 minutes. We have till 9 o'clock, but it's not required. I mean, we're here for as long as there are questions. So I'll leave that to you, Susan, to decide how long we continue.
Oh, I think you're on mute, Susan.
Oh,
Thank you. So please feel free to share more questions in the chat. I will ask more, and unless you come up with something. Julia, your whole idea of this feedback loop, I've never heard anything like that before. I find it very fascinating, and it's something that I really look forward to exploring more in your writing. And could you return to that and lead us through it, because there are a couple of things, and one was the role of guilt. So there's the mimesis, there's the loving mimesis of Christ. That's one form of, say, Orthodox Christianity. And then there's the corruption of it. That's the second form, in which is contextualized by white supremacy. And that they're in this, they're in a feedback loop, kind of feeding each other. Could you return to that and explain that again?
So I'm Presbyterian now. I'll just use just the history of how Presbyterians are caught, especially Southern Presbyterians are caught in this sort of double bind. If I look at General Assembly papers, General Assembly is the highest governing body of Presbyterian churches. Presbyterians write down everything. And so I'm able to find discussions and rulings from the early 1700s. And so in 1787, there was a call among all Presbyterians to deal with the issue of slavery, because technically there's an understanding that Christians should not enslave under other Christians. And so here you see the gospel of Jesus Christ, to love your neighbor as yourself and to not, oppress anyone. Southern Presbyterians are very aware of the calling of Christ to love one's neighbor and to not mete out violence. And yet you see this feedback loop where wealthy Southern planters push against the emancipation of their slaves in 1787. And you see this ongoing conversation back and forth, where at first slavery is said to be pushed to be ended by the 1800s. And then you see, well, by the 1800s, the General Assembly has said, well, it's too controversial to talk, and we don't want to isolate our Southern brothers. And so there's this back and forth between individuals, ministers, communities coming to say, this is wrong, this is against God, this is not in the model of Christ. And planters saying, yes, but what can we do? We believe that it's not. And so they start becoming more nuanced in how they interpret the scriptures. They begin to make biblical justifications for scriptures. And then they even start doing what I call very specific demonstrations on how they can still remain Christian and enslave other human beings, especially converted slaves to Christianity. And one of those, if you want to do a quick Google search, is on slave catechisms. You have Presbyterians create these teachings to slaves, and they come back to the General Assembly and say, see, we're really following the model of Christ because we're evangelizing our slaves. We're teaching them the dictates of Christianity, and yet we're not freeing them. And so you see and I could probably use the Methodists too, but in Presbyterians, there's this constant feedback loop between what a Christian ought to be and how Southerners are redefining what Christianity is.
Wow, it occurs to me that I mean, these debates were a part of the revolutionary era, and they chose not to pursue freedom for the slaves, even though there were people who were asking for it at the time of the revolution and the institution of the new government. Do you think that the mimetic crisis that maybe threat was in the background as a possible threat between, say, the aristocratic class of whites and the landless whites who weren't even franchised in the Constitution? They didn't have the vote right away. Do you think that slavery had any role in terms of, say, mitigating possible mimetic crisis that could have occurred? I mean, democracy is an experiment, isn't it? And we know from the perspective of mimetic theory that leveling creates more rivalry. So
Yeah, that's such a great assessment. I totally agree with that. You make me think of so here in North Carolina, overseers who were sort of middlemen between the planter elites and the enslaved classes. You have poor whites who are overwhelmingly Scotch Irish, who are poor. They are now made to be overseers. And so it's almost as if, in order to keep the enslaved populations from connecting with the poor whites, they try to mitigate rivalry between poor whites and themselves by making them a middle class, almost by creating them as spaces over the lowest of the low, according to that paradigm, where overseers and people who are merchants are allowed to have more social capital than enslaved and even indentured servants. So I totally think that there are very strategic ways. And you make me think of Charleston, South Carolina. There were so many mixed race adults produced out of the colonial period, between Europeans and African enslaved Africans, most of them probably by raped or in sexual assault. But by the 1830s, there were so many mixed race, or what historians have noted as mulatto people, that South Carolina created a third caste system in order to create more secure standing of the wealthy white elite from the large enslaved population that totally outnumbered South Carolinians almost like 10-1 in places like Charleston. So.
Oh, we have a bunch of questions now. So here is Paul. Follow up to Andrew's question. Does nonviolent Christian practice fall into rivalry with the white supremacist current? Or does the tendency of sacred violence to project itself on others make nonviolent practice difficult to see as nonviolent? In other words, the violent project their violence on others and so presume violence, even when there's nonviolence. Could that be considered a feedback loop?
That's a good question. I'm not sure. So let me bounce this back a little bit. So Martin Luther King trained people to respond to violence in nonviolent ways. And one story is one of his, one person who was part of the Congress of Racial Equality, is a young person. He is at a demonstration. He is accosted by a group of young white men who beat him mercilessly while he's at, at that time they had payphones. And so he's standing in a payphone and they find out that he's Black and he was part of this march. And so they accost him in the payphone and they just beat him. And because he's had this training and he's a Christian, he's a minister, as he is reporting this story. This is in the documentary This Far by Faith, published by PBS. He goes on to tell the story about how he felt was the presence of God that came over him. And every time he was beaten, he kept standing up. We just have strength to stand up. And he would just stand up and not raise his fist, not even speak against them. He just kept standing up. And he stood up so many times that the mob or group of young white men, they'd stop beating him. And so when I look at that, I say that is a non-violent response to violence. It disrupted what could have been a feedback loop. Had he raised his hand, had he decided to verbally curse them or just show any kind of attitude, they both would have been in that double bind, in that feedback loop. But because he responded with the presence of Christ and with this nonviolent action, it disrupted. Now I can play devil's advocate with myself and say that the only violence that would have been part of that feedback loop is that he allowed violence to be done to his body. Which is a whole nother story about what it means to be nonviolent and yet know that your body might be violently victimized.
Yeah. It's a terrible, terrible position to be in. This is from Rebecca. What has been the response to your research in the Academy in African American Studies, and more recently within the Girardian community?
So the Girardian community has been pretty supportive of my research in Africana studies or other areas there. I have some colleagues that are like, why are you using a Eurocentric view to talk about the experiences of African Americans? And I usually have to argue to the point about I'm interested in using mimetic theory to understand how to disrupt the violence. And so it doesn't matter what tools or what racial positionality that the thinkers I love to think with are. I'm not about that. So I would say 50-50 in areas where the academic study of African American religion has been claimed. Some of my colleagues are very supportive and some of them are not, but those that are not are sometimes operating from a prejudicial paradigm, which is not helpful. So thanks, Rebecca.
Thank you. This is from George. Would it be fair to say that racism primarily benefited wealthy property owners because it made it harder to establish Black-white solidarity to challenge class privilege? If so, could you comment on how that has worked historically? So you kind of talked about that before, but would you like to say more?
Oh, yeah, thank you for that question. There's lots of examples of that. I agree that it was very strategic on wealthy landed white males to perpetuate racism, and poor whites brought into that ideology because they are, it was somewhat of an advantage to them. I'll just talk a little bit about burial grounds. I'm going to talk about that in Chicago, but one of the things is that wealthy white elites here in the city of Charlotte, they have very well maintained historic burial grounds that primarily hold the bodies of white Christian wealthy Presbyterians, 300, 400 years old here in the city. If I look at other churches, many of the poor for white middle classes, they have cemeteries, but they're not as historic. Some of them weren't allowed to always be buried in those places. And then if I look at indigenous, I cannot find any indigenous burial grounds in the city of Charlotte. And this is where the Catawba and the Sugaree and the Shira roamed and lived and traded. And there's hardly anything. There are no burial sites for them. African Americans, there are few and sprinkled out throughout the city, but very covered up and neglected. And the only reason, think about this, the only reason that those burial grounds are allowed to exist is because they were connected to landed, wealthy white elites who decided that particular enslaved people had a right to be buried in their backyards, church backyards. So that's one way that it translates.
Mhm. This is from Matthew. Guilt plays a role, but also shame. Colonialism imposes shame on indigenous peoples, treating them as subhuman, lazy, stupid, etc. That externally imposed shame often becomes internalized so that oppressed peoples lose their own self-respect. But colonists also impose, in jest, shame on themselves because they have treated others in such denial of the golden rule. A lot of the power of shame lies in its secrecy, the sense that it is unspeakable. How do you think we might deal with that shame on both sides in order to work our way out of colonialism and racism?
Wow, thank you for that question.
And he says, I'd love to see a discussion of the mimetics of shame.
That sounds like a book. That sounds good. The first thing that comes to mind is, so I work with a neuroscientist. His name is Jim Wilder, and he studies the brain and trauma. You'll hear a little bit of this in my talk in June, but one of the things that Wilder says is he noted that healthy shame is one way to help the brain get out of a brain cramp, meaning to get out of trauma.
Mm.
And so sometimes when these colonial histories are brought to bear to descendant communities, especially white descendant communities, there is a bit of trauma in hearing family histories or just hearing your culture's history. And there's shame in that. Wilder would say that if you can have healthy shame that generates you to move out of stagnancy and begin to confront and do something without debilitating you into stagnancy, he said that's good. And so, but of course, healthy shame, according to neuroscience, is that you are able to deal with the negative story knowing that you are connected with someone that is glad to be with you. Jim Wilder's a neuroscientist, and so that someone is typically God, who always accepts you and loves you, who stands with you in these negative stories and helps you process them with him. So
I'm thinking of the way we treat the environment and the earth and the shame that may be demobilizing us or immobilizing us. Yeah. Okay, so we have a bunch more here, which is wonderful. Here's Vern. Thanks so much for your sharing. You have effortlessly shown how much homework you have done on African American history. It is a privilege to have a window into that experience. Well said, Vern. And this is Maura. Father James Allison will be speaking on shame and God's love at the Theology and Peace Conference.
all right.
Some good dialogue there, I'm sure. And this is Paul. Do you have a reference to the story you told about the man who kept getting knocked down and had the experience of communion with Christ to get back up and not retaliate?
Yeah, I said that, but you might have missed it. It is a documentary called This Far by Faith. and it's a PBS, public broadcasting documentary. And it is part of the documentary that is on the civil rights movement and highlights Reverend Prathia Hall. So if you find, I don't know what number that is, but that's that reference, Paul.
Thanks. And here's Vern again. Coming out of your thought presentation, it becomes tragically clear that many base their very identities on being superior. This means that the superiority becomes an object of mimetic desire. During a time of liberation of oppressed people, the formerly inferior become equal, thus diminishing the very identities of those with superiority-based identity. They feel diminished. This can be seen in the emergence of women as equal to men.
Yeah, absolutely. That's so good, Vern, and so insightful, and really lays out why people feel so threatened by the freedom of Indigenous and African peoples.
Mm-hmm. And this is Rebecca. Have you ever found that simply talking factually about race and racial historical realities causes anxiety for some people or makes them feel antagonistic? This has been called white fragility by some, which may or may not be a helpful term. I've seen this happen both in academic contexts or more often in a church setting. Can you comment on your experiences with this? How do we talk about emotionally fraught topics such as racism?
Okay, so you're in here. Thank you, Rebecca. That's such a great question. You're going to hear my talk in Chicago about the ways in which my work with Jim Wilder and brain science maps on to your term, Rebecca, loving mimesis. And what's key in my analysis is so to answer your question, yes, when I work with churches where I have the descendants of the enslaved and those who enslaved them, they may be 6 or 7 generations away from their ancestors, but they're at the table not only with that history, but also with fresh memories of racial discrimination or oppression. That happens a lot when I share, these are how many people this church owned in the antebellum period. Here are the name of the slave owners. People get really upset. And but my husband and I, we have a ministry called More Grace Ministries, and we do lots of what we call capacity building work with those that come to the table. And part of that capacity building is a combination of neuroscience and contemplative prayer practice, where we encourage people to process this history, process the truth with a connection to God. And if they feel anxiety, if they feel anger, we stop, we pause, and we lead them to connect with God in particular kinds of ways in order to keep their brains on, neuroscience wise, but also to understand that they are not in this moment alone hearing this hard history. They have the presence of God with them. They have the presence of Jesus helping them process that. And there's more to that, but that's how my husband and I, with the help of the Lord, through us by his grace, does this to keep people at the table. And we see God do just tremendous miracles in that respect. So again, that's the minister hat that I'm wearing at this moment. I am not speaking for UNC Charlotte. So.
That's beautiful. That really is. Paul says, thank you. There's even a transcript of the PBS documentary. So if anyone's interested, Paul has put that in the chat. And I want to say, this has been a wonderful talk, Julia. to echo Vern, you have taught us so much in this 45 minutes, and it's obvious that you've done a great deal of research. I did not know about George Lynch and the history of lynching and its connection to the American Revolution and the treatment of Tories. And it makes sense. I mean, like, you're connecting the dots, and we need them connected. So, and as you said, you're filling in the gaps that James Cone's analysis left open. And I think that that is a huge service. And just bringing Girard together with Cone really does have to happen. So I'm so glad you're the person to do it, obviously. So
Thank you so much. It's been a delight, everybody. Thank you for this invitation again. And Susan, thank you for the wonderful questions and hosting the chat.
oh, my pleasure. Thank you.